Hello and welcome to Weekly MTG. I'm your host, Blake Rasmussen, and today we are talking about the big news from yesterday, the banned and restricted announcement that went out and had a few small changes in some formats and then some big changes for standard, which was intentional. Today, to talk with us about that, to answer your questions, both from the internet, the Discord, and chat as we go along, we have Jadine and Carmen Comparens. Real quick, what are your roles in all of this BNR stuff?
Yeah, Jadine, I am the play design technical lead, which means that I am primarily concerned with standard, watching the final rates of our cards, and was very involved in the standard decisions here.
And I am Carmen Comparens. As you said at the top of the show, I'm a senior game designer on the competitive play design team. A lot of what I do is keep an eye on the non-rotating stuff. I think a lot about Modern, I think a lot about Pioneer, Legacy, Vintage, all of that cool stuff. But we're here to talk about Standard for the most part.
For the most part, we are going to, so what we're going to do, we're going to start actually with the non-standard actions we took. So the formats where we didn't take any actions, we're going to set those aside for now. We'll probably talk about some of those in the Q&A section. We are going to talk quickly about two arena formats where we made some small tweaks, and then we're going to spend the bulk of the time after that talking about standard. So first of all, a card that maybe it's somebody's favorite card. It might be. It's probably several people's favorite card, but. Tibbles Trickery, we killed it in Pioneer Best of One. Tell us the story there.
Right, so this is one that's very specific to Arena, where the Best of One format is very popular. This is one that was showing up at a much higher clip than we really wanted. It's particularly good for trying to get your daily quests done, right? This is a deck that could win as early as the third turn. It mulligans super aggressively to do something where it finds a copy of Ornithopter, for example, any 0-mana card, and then on turn 2 counters its own spell with Tibbles Trickery, and then hopes to, quote-unquote, randomly hit some giant unbeatable spell and then beat the opponent on the third, sometimes if it's unlucky, the fourth turn. And if it's really unlucky, it just hits another Ornithopter, and that player concedes and goes next.
Yeah.
It's a pretty intensely negative experience on the other side of the table to feel like you're not really engaging with a game of Magic at all. And it was happening with a kind of surprisingly high number of games, and Best of One in particular. And when that's such a popular way to play the format on Arena, then we want to make sure that Arena players are having a good time and the like. It's something where we didn't really see this come up very much in Best of Three. Once sideboards get involved or you get more tuned versions of decks, this type of thing really falls off pretty hard. It's just falls over to a stiff Spell Pierce, right?
Yeah.
And there are definitely the tools to fight this sort of thing within the format. And it was a phenomenon we mostly observed in Best of One. It wasn't really happening in Best of Three, even on Arena.
Yeah.
So this is one where Arena mostly just wanted to kind of wash their hands of it and move on.
As did we all. All right.
Whoa.
As did most of us. All right, let's move on to Historic. This was a big one for Control fans. Counterspell has been banned in Historic since it was originally printed into the format with the Strixhaven Mystical Archive. It has been unleashed. Talk about this one.
So this is one where blue has generally just not been as popular as of late as it was whenever the format was first created or first introduced on Arena. So this is one where the Arena team really wants to find ways to be able to impact the format, and a lot of why it exists is because ideally, if a card exists on Arena, we want there to be a home for you to play it.
Yeah.
So this is just having more cards be legal in more places. As of late, I know Sorin Imperious Bloodlord has been making a huge splash in Historic in particular. We had a qualifier weekend this last weekend where it was very successful. I know the team is going to be keeping a good look on the format as a whole, but it looked like blue could use a shot in the arm, and Counterspell is just one of the most iconic cards ever, right?
Yeah. Well, and to your point about wanting cards to have homes on Arena, Timeless was created to give that sort of home, but in that format, Counterspell is overshadowed by Mana Drain. Yeah, and so Counterspell kind of fell into this weird place where it was banned in Historic, but not quite good enough for, you'd see it as like maybe the 5th or 6th Counterspell in Timeless, but I'm glad it's going to get to see some play in Historic now.
Yeah, same.
All right, let's move on to the main course. I have seen some comments on various other non-standard formats in chat. We will talk about those. We're going to be happy to. But the bulk of the news, and by bulk I mean 7 whole cards, were banned in Standard. So that on its face is a lot of cards, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the philosophy of this yearly rotation, what you're aiming to do before we get into individual card choices.
Yeah, absolutely. So like Blake said, we do have a rotation coming up, and right before that we have this kind of early rotation window where we're kind of preparing the format to be as fun as possible after rotation. So when Edge of Eternities comes out in a little bit here, we're going to see Dominaria United, Brothers War, Phyrexia All Will Be One, and March of the Machines all rotate out of the format, taking with them former Standard All-Stars like Shieldred, currently format-defining removal spell Cutdown, a whole host of lands, and in general just shaking up the format a great deal. And, we don't really know what's going to happen when the Edge of Eternities cards get into the mix and all these other things happen. But our goal with these bans is to, for the most part, make sure that the format is fun and to some extent fresh after the rotation, that you're seeing new things and we're not just falling into the same default patterns of stuff that hasn't been very fun and that everyone's kind of sick of. Our bans were, for the most part, outside of Corey Steelcutter, which we'll get into, targeted at cards that aren't very fun or reduce create play patterns that we think aren't desirable, or just kind of reduce the number of viable cards and decks in the format. So we're trying to open things up and make things as fun as possible for the next rotation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the rotation is important to highlight here because there have been a lot of changes in our calendar lately, and we've got another one coming next year, which we'll talk about later. But that can kind of leave some people lost in the shuffle about what exactly is happening. So yeah, it's good to highlight that those sets are rotating out, and we're going to get some even more fresh Standard at that point. Okay, so you brought up Corey Steelcutter. Let's start there because that one certainly is different than the rest.
Yeah, so Corey Steelcutter is different in that it is just a very clear and very obvious ban. It was powering this Is It Prowess deck, which really took the metagame by storm, had a play rate at the Pro Tour above 40%. Its win rate was fairly high. It dominated the last set of regional championships and overall had a stronger presence in the metagame than we want. This is above all of our thresholds for banning. Play rate and win rate. You can also see its effect on the rest of the format in how warped they had to get to play around this card. A lot more temporary lockdowns is one of the few good answers to Corey Steelcutter and a host of prowess creatures. Lots of Magebane Lizards as something to punish you for playing a bunch of spells, and that wasn't even really enough to keep the deck down.
So is so loud.
So yeah, this card clearly was a bit too strong for the format. Needed to go, would have gone in any of our windows available if we had seen this level of metagame dominance.
So if we were in November right now,
yes,
you would have banned Corey Steelcutter.
We would have banned Corey Steelcutter. We would ban another card that is creating an effect on the metagame to that pronounced.
Okay.
We want to keep things a little more open-ended than that, and the Is It Prowess format is not our vision for Standard.
Okay. All right. Now let's move on to another interesting one. So this card's been around for a bit, but really got supercharged when Omniscience was printed in Foundation. So Abuelo's Awakening, which helped create the blue-white Omniscience combo deck.
Yeah, so combo is something we really want to be part of Standard fundamentally. That's one of our big paradigm shifts of Standard, moving from our old 2-year rotation model to our new 3-year rotation model, is Standard is going to have more cards, and it's going to have a wider diversity of play experiences. We're going to see lower to the ground aggro decks, more streamlined control decks, and we're going to start to see some combo decks. And I was really happy for a while seeing the Omniscience deck exist, because that's kind of everything coming to fruition and kind of getting that full range of what Magic can be, all encapsulated within Standard. However, the Omniscience deck, as it existed, powered by the Abuelo's Awakening and getting all those upgrades with Tarkir Dragonstorm in the Dragon package for the deck, really took off. And we have to be pretty careful with combo decks, because they can be one of the least fun experiences when they're really strong in the format, when you have to expect to play against Omniscience pretty consistently and watch them take these really long turns if you didn't draw the very specific pieces of interaction you need. So we were worried, especially after all these other changes we were going to make, that the Omniscience deck would be the de facto deck to beat in the rest of the format, so we decided to take action and ban Abuelo's Awakening.
Now, a question we've seen quite a bit is why Abuelo's Awakening and not Omniscience itself?
Yeah, it comes down to kind of that part earlier about wanting combo to exist in the format. And we do think the Omniscience deck is really close to being the kind of combo we want in the format. It's just a bit too strong, and it forces players to react to it a little bit too early, since Abuelo's Awakening can threaten to end the game on turn 4 if the appropriate setup is there. There are other ways in the format to reanimate your Omniscience, and the deck can still exist in a weaker form with these other options that either cost more mana or have some additional hoop or some kind of extra deck building thing to exist. We hope that the deck will continue to exist in some form with those options and be at a more reasonable play rate that is what we want for combo decks in our format.
Okay.
Like, ultimately, we really want people who like combo decks to feel like Standard is a place for them.
Yeah.
Where if you're like, oh, no, well, but this is the kind of thing that I like, we don't want people to feel priced into combo, because it is a stranger form of Magic. But it shouldn't be something that just does not exist.
Yeah, so you want some kind of Omniscience deck to exist, but this one was but Abuelo's Awakening was a little too fast.
Yeah, we're willing to give it another shot at least. If we end up back here because Omniscience is too strong, Omniscience will be next to go.
Okay.
But we're going to give it another chance here.
Okay. All right, let's talk about a card we will not be giving another chance. It is Monstrous Rage. This one has been on a lot of people's lists for a long time, but I've also seen others say, hey, if the best card in Standard is a pump spell, we're in a pretty good place. You all landed on giving Rage the boot, so how did you land there?
Yeah, so it was kind of a hard decision, because for my money, Monstrous Rage is fundamentally the most fun card that we banned. Combat tricks are fun, kind of having that guessing game if they have it or not.
None of you could see the look Carmen gave her when she said that, but go on.
No, it's in a good way. It's in a good way. We just like to argue at home about how fun pump spells are.
Yeah, okay.
In any case, it is a fun card, but it was giving red too much strength and specifically too much power against creatures. We kind of want red aggro to be stymied by creatures. You get out ahead early, you have your 1 and 2 drops that can take over the game, but then the mid-range decks of the format should be able to play a creature that's a little bit bigger than yours, and you should end up in trouble because blocking is powerful counterplay. There were multiple elements going on in the format that made that not true, but Monstrous Rage was the biggest offender, giving trample now so that you can't chump block, and trample until your creature dies, so you can never chump block on your big threats, was a really large problem. So we have other 3 power pump spells. We have other trample tricks, but there is no other 3 power trample trick in the format, and we think that was adding a good amount of power and limiting the counterplay to the red decks.
Okay. All right. And I know that was a card that the community's been calling for a while. But you all went a step further with the red decks and also banned Heartfire Hero, a little mouse who, oh my god, every time I see this card, I immediately am like, game 2. All right.
Right. Because you think of Heartfire Hero turn 1, Manifold Mouse turn 2, attack for 4. Next turn they're attacking for 6. Maybe they Monstrous Rage. Maybe it's much more than 6. So yeah, Heartfire Hero and Manifold Mouse go hand in hand here. It was that 1-2 punch of really early double strike, which is powerful on its face and even more powerful in combination with any kind of plus power effect that you might have. That was really taking our red decks from typical aggressive decks that can fall off if they don't get far enough ahead and can kind of have other people ramp up their defenses and then turn the corner on them, into these combo aggro decks, which were not even that concerned necessarily about getting chip-in damage along the way, but were very capable of ending the game from really healthy life totals of 12 and 16.
Yeah.
And just creating a lot of fear in opponents and not letting the games be as fun as they could be. We want games to have that kind of natural arc to them, where the aggressive decks get out ahead early, they're ahead, the other decks come back, and it's kind of a question of if aggro can get those last 3 points in, or if the mid-range or the control decks can stabilize and take over the game. When the aggro decks have such wide power to end the game from high life totals, it's the balance of power really tilts in their favor in a way that isn't very fun. We know players were pretty sick of that. We know it was very frustrating to have to play decks that could either answer Heartfire Hero in a specific way by not caring about its death trigger, or just played a ton of 1-mana removal so you could interact early. It was really limiting the card options in the format. So for those reasons, we were pretty convinced Heartfire Hero into Manifold Mouse would still be strong if we didn't take action with or without Monstrous Rage, so we decided Heartfire Hero needed to go.
And I think your point about limiting options is really good, because I think that version of red deck was very frustrating for a lot of players, where normally something that we like is there to be a clear direction to go. If a deck is beating you up, there should be some deck you can reach to where you go, all right, you know what, I'm tired of losing to aggro, I'm going to load up on blockers. Not against Monstrous Rage. Okay, maybe something that's a little faster. Not against these fast combo kills. Okay, maybe a bunch of removal. Not against Heartfire Hero. So it just was sort of a compounding issue.
Sure. Now, I mean, you mentioned several other parts of, we'll call it the mouse package. I know some other people pointed to Screaming Nemesis. How did you land on Heartfire Hero specifically being the notch you want to take out of Red's belt?
Yeah, we thought it was most important to attack the combo of Heartfire Hero into Manifold Mouse and that early access to Double Strike. So one of those 2 cards was pretty early landed on as our target. After that, we thought most about what would allow the mouse package to continue to exist in some form, and decided that Manifold Mouse, maybe you start looking at some of the white mice options and play something like that. But for players who came in with Bloomburrow or really latched on to some of the Bloomburrow themes, we wanted that deck to still exist in some form, albeit weakened.
I lost yesterday to a white-red mouse deck that replaced this with the one that gives all mice +1/+0 as its heroic or valiant ability.
Just as intended. Perfect.
Just as intended.
I know the one you're talking about. I never speculate on a card name in my life.
No. I think it's also worth noting, in a lot of the pump spell focused red decks, some of them also had Cacophony Scamp as another sort of pseudo Manifold Mouse. That one's rotating as well. Yeah.
Yep.
That name I got because, again, I also died to that yesterday. Okay, let's switch from the aggressive track to talking about some card advantage, which is Up the Beanstock, another card that has been on some folks' radars for a while.
So I'll back up here a second to before the release of Tarkir Dragonstorm and Corey Steelcutter, the format kind of had 3 big decks. There was the red decks, which we've just talked about, powered by Manifold Mouse and Killing You Quick. There was the Pixie decks, Nurturing Pixie, pick up your enchantments, kill a bunch of stuff. And then there was the Domain Overlords deck with Up the Beanstalk, a deck that prior to the Overlords coming out in the last standard format, we had seen as a domain control deck with a lot of the going up to Atraxa at the end of the game. So we've seen this Up the Beanstalk deck for a while. We knew that last standard format before Tarkir had a bunch of decks that were very likely to be strong, and there were some patterns in those decks that we weren't the happiest with, and we knew they were going to be a really easy fallback with rotation and still likely to be strong. So Up the Beanstalk is the card that really leaps out from those slower decks, as this is a source of card advantage that isn't the most appropriate. There are so many ways to cheat Up the Beanstalk. We've all seen it. We know you can, in previous standards, Leyline Binding gets you there. There's just Ride's End from Aether Drift got there. Like, there's just so many ways to do it. We're going to release more of them. We've kind of seen this trick before. We're not that excited about it. It's a hard card to fight. Not really a good, easy answer to Up the Beanstalk. So we decided, let's open things up. Let's see what ramp decks look like when they don't have access to this card.
Yeah. Okay. And I think we've already started to see in some cards that have been printed since then, though the wording changed, not to the mana value being 5, but how much mana was spent to actually get the effect. That seems intentional.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that in a lot of ways, Up the Beanstalk's heart was in the right place. Normally it's asking you to play a lot of cards that are pretty hard to play with. But in actuality, it kind of just narrowed the answers that people actually were willing to play, because you end up in spots where you end up wanting to play the ones that draw you a card every time you cast them, and it isn't really that fun most of the time, and it feels pretty hacky whenever your whole deck is doing the thing.
All right. Speaking of hacky, I hated this card. Next up is Hopeless Nightmare, which also describes how you felt when this card kept returning to people's hands and coming back into play. But talk about this card.
Yeah, so Hopeless Nightmare was the card we landed on as being the correct choice to ban from the Pixie Shells. Deciding on a card to ban from those decks was actually pretty complicated. Fundamentally, the Nurturing Pixie self-bounce stuff is pretty cool. It's kind of a different way to play Magic. We haven't seen that stuff show up a lot in Standard, and it very rarely translates into being good enough for formats more powerful than Standard to just replay a bunch of the same tricky stuff. It has happened occasionally, but this was kind of a unique deck that was abstractly cool and was doing a lot of things that we liked. It was also doing a lot of things that we didn't like that much. Enter Hopeless Nightmare as kind of the key trinket piece that both is really frustrating to play against. You lose a lot of cards from your hand. You have to think about playing to the battlefield, not leaving stuff in your hand, because if you do, they'll just pick up the Hopeless Nightmare and get rid of them. And if you don't leave cards in your hand, that's fine. They'll pick up something else. So it put you really in a bind playing against this deck. And the damage tacked on meant that the deck was really strong at being an aggressive deck at the same time. It wasn't just playing this value game. It also got to have a meaningful clock and really take advantage of Nurturing Pixie being a 2-power flyer. That deck has also existed in a lot of different shells. Like, it's been Esper, it's been white-black. So it was not the easiest to find a clear target to reduce its strength, but Hopeless Nightmare is one of the commonalities that has been in all of the versions.
Yeah, and I think when you see people playing Obstinate Baloth in their sideboards of non-green decks,
loud sign.
Yeah, it's a loud sign that something's going on with that card.
I think something also that I really just want to zoom in on this card in particular is I think it's one of the ones that is the most emblematic of trying to address play patterns to make the format more fun, rather than just looking at all of the top decks and just saying, all right, let's identify the strongest card and delete it.
Yeah.
Where something that Jade alluded to there was that to sort of pick up my permanent, replay it again is something that we've seen be beloved by players in Pauper. I know in Modern Horizons 3 Limited, I think it was called Soul Reliquary.
That sounds right.
Playtest name was Skyfisher Sail, because it is such an iconic pattern that so many players liked. That card also scored disproportionately well on some of our posthumous surveys for the set, where we want the actual Pixie Shells to be something that players feel like they can do in Standard and have fun with. This part is just sort of net negative fun whenever it is part of the shell.
Yep, makes sense to me. I want to pause on this card. We do have one other card to talk about there, but there is a good question in chat that was addressed in the article, but not everybody reads the article, and that's totally fine. But it's a good talking point here because you highlighted it, and I thought it was really insightful. So have you considered just not pushing 1-drops to be better and better every single set if you don't want games to end turn 4. People didn't abuse Beanstock, but rather used it in the only way that the card pool allowed for.
Yeah, so as you said, this was something in the article as one of kind of our key learnings. And we always knew we were going to have a lot to learn about how 3-year standard looks and how it plays out. But we know generally in Magic, as formats get bigger and there's a larger card pool, it compresses the curves and pushes the strongest strategies to the ones that can best use the cheapest cards. When your deck is primarily 1-mana spells or 1-mana and 2-mana spells, you just get a lot more flexibility. You're less punished by the game engine elements of not drawing enough lands, and you get to build your deck in a way where you are just taking a lot of game actions, and this can be really powerful when the 1-mana cards exist in the wild in a way that allows you to do this, which is more and more possible the more cards there are, and thus the more 1-mana cards there are. We want Standard to be a format where 3 and 4-mana cards are the stars of the show a lot of the time, that you can depend on playing your 4-drop and you can build around it. So yes, we are thinking about the role of 1-mana cards. Yes, I think a lot of the cards on this list are examples of 1-mana cards that have a little too much bang for their buck, and we are looking and thinking about where we should tone down, both on 1-mana cards and on cards like Corey Steelcutter that say, play me with 1-mana cards, and reward you for building your deck in that way.
All right. Okay. We're going to talk about one more card in Standard. I'm seeing a bunch of great questions in chat. We are going to get to those. As always, it helps me find your question if you tag @Magic at the start of it. And we will be spending some time, once we're done with Standard, talking about just whatever you guys want to talk about. But first, we're going to talk about This Town Ain't Big Enough.
Yeah, so This Town Ain't Big Enough is a weird one on this list because it doesn't cleanly attack a single deck. Some people look at this card and think it is a attack on the Nurturing Pixie decks, because those decks have employed it alongside in their Esper shells. Some people remember it's like 1 or 2 of use in Is It Prowess decks a lot of the time. There's been other decks in Standard's history. Mostly this card always shows up alongside Storm Chaser's talent and can be a little bit of an engine for any blue deck that wants it or can take use of it. This card is really generous in a lot of ways. The fact that it can bounce 2 of your things for 2 mana, the fact that it can bounce any non-land permanent and not just creatures. It can be a fairly oppressive card in the way that it both interacts with your opponent while advancing your own game plan when you have strong things to bounce it with. And at the same time, it's always played alongside Storm Chaser's talent as one of the strongest things to bounce. In the loop that's created with Storm Chaser's talent's 4-mana ability to return an instant or sorcery from your hand means that this can be on the table forever when games go long. And it's this really frustrating late game that doesn't come up all that often, but is really frustrating when it does. So we decided we were pretty sure those 2 cards would keep seeing play if we let them unchecked, and decided Standard would be better off without that element. So we decided to ban This Town Ain't Big Enough.
Was there a discussion, so you paired it with Storm Chaser's talent. Was there discussion about should it be Storm Chaser's talent or should it be this town?
Yep, we did discuss that, and basically it came down to thinking Storm Chaser's talent had more potential to create a fun Standard in a world where This Town Ain't Big Enough doesn't exist than This Town Ain't Big Enough has to create fun games if Storm Chaser's talent doesn't exist.
Fair enough.
There's a degree where banning Storm Chaser's talent doesn't exactly ban This Town Ain't Big Enough, but it probably ain't knocking that hard on the door.
Yeah.
Whereas taking out Storm Chaser's talent, or excuse me, taking out this town, there are still Storm Chaser's talent decks. Like, we think players enjoy playing with that card for the most part, as long as it doesn't have this insurmountable end game.
Yep. All right. Makes sense. Okay. We are going to, well, actually, first, let's real quick recap. Let's show all the cards banned in Standard, these 7 cards. This change has already taken effect in digital platforms. It is fully in effect if you play anywhere in tabletop. So new Standard is a go, and we're going to start seeing some results from that pretty quickly. interested to see where that goes. There were a few decks in the Pro Tour, not many, but some decks in the Pro Tour were not affected by this, and I think we were talking about Paulo Vitor Domadoros's Vivi's
Agatha's Soul Cauldron.
Cauldron deck. Before this, there's some others, so I think we'll see some cool stuff coming out. All right, now let's move on to some questions. So we grabbed some questions from the Discord, we grabbed some from social media, and I've been watching chat a bit, but again, feel free to tag at Magic in chat, and we will get to as many questions as we possibly can in the next half an hour. So let's start with... weirdly enough, I'm going to take this first one because there's questions about the cadence. Why is the next announcement in November? What is the cadence like? So it has been a hot minute since we had this discussion. So this was maybe a little over a year ago that we changed the cadence. And basically what happened was we were in a world where we were doing bans ahead of essentially each set release, which was fine. We also lived in a world prior to that where we did bans kind of whenever we wanted, which was less fine and sort of chaotic. However, the real effect of bans that we always had to try to fudge and play around with were high-level events. So RCQs, regional championships, pro tours. So we always had this sort of awkward side discussion where, like, this is our date. What sort of exceptions do we need to make for tournaments? Do we need to let people know further ahead of time? Do we need to shift the date? And ultimately, we decided that we were going to shift our BNR cadence to care more about, not exclusively, but more about high-level play. So, for example, one of the questions we saw was, why no changes with Modern? What do you think with Modern? We had previously announced there was going to be no Modern changes for this window because we are in the middle of a Modern RCQ season, and we didn't want to mess with people who, were picking a deck and trying to play it week after week kind of deal. It leads to a lot of chaos. It leads to people prepping a deck on Sunday for the tournament that weekend and suddenly having it invalidated on Monday. So we moved to a world where it is built more around the high-level play schedule, and so November was sort of the next window that we looked at that made sense both for play and set releases. We made a sort of exception for this window because the standard rotation is so important to high-level goals, and so that's why we made the Modern exception. So when you look at cadence, right now the answer is largely because that is what lined up best to interfere least with tournaments people are preparing for. So that's sort of the high-level schedule question. Okay. Next, we have seen, so we just spent a lot of time talking about Standard, and a lot of people have pointed out that a number of these cards, especially the red ones, the mouse package, are seeing a lot of play in Pioneer. Mm-hmm. Was there any thought, discussion, what's the difference? Why take these cards out of Standard, leave them in Pioneer? How closely did you look at some of those similarities? Yeah.
So in general, Pioneer is a place that we want people to be able to play their Standard cards whenever they graduate from Standard, mm-hmm. either by an organic rotation or an early one like this one, to be a little cheeky about it. But lately, we know red is something that has been a large part of the Pioneer metagame for a while.
Yep.
For the most part, play rate numbers of Pioneer have held somewhat strong. We've gotten a lot of people questioning the prevalence of red in particular in the format. That's something we're going to be keeping a close eye on over time. But at the end of the day, we do think that Standard cards showing up in Pioneer is a fairly positive thing, especially in some of the higher synergy packages that mm-hmm. can be out there. I know it was really cool whenever the Overlords were showing up in the Enigmatic Incarnation deck.
Yeah.
Out of Duskmourn, 6 months or so ago. So I think it varies a lot on a case-by-case basis. I've been really excited about some of the variations of Mono Black midrange that have showed up, whether it's the Demons package or the Mox Amber one that's fueling the thing. But in general, we're seeing standard cards do things that we want them to in Pioneer. We don't want people to feel like cards evaporate whenever they rotate from standard. We want them to have a home for them, and Pioneer is a pretty reasonable place for that.
Okay. Next, let's move on to Legacy. We've seen a lot of thoughts. I'll say this was probably the part of the announcement that received the most negativity, the no changes. Can you talk a bit more about your thoughts behind no changes to Legacy?
Yeah, definitely. So I know the Oops All Spells deck is a pretty major point of contention within the community, and it is honestly a really hard choice every time, and it has been every time. So something I want to lead on is that, in general, the further back you go in Magic formats, so as each grade of expanding the card pool from Standard to Pioneer to Modern to Legacy to Vintage and so on, we generally become progressively more tolerant of, let's say, unsavory play patterns, because each layer of hard to get into the format that it is, either from how hard it is to get the cards or just knowing enough cards, kind of has an additional degree of you are opting into this experience.
Yeah.
So Oops All Spells, for anyone who isn't super familiar, uses a bunch of MDFC cards that are not technically lands on the front, and then cards that say target player mills until they hit a land. They target themselves, they mill their whole deck, and then they're able to win from there. It usually involves a Thassa's Oracle, either via Dread Return or Memory's Journey. So this is a deck that got a huge shot in the arm for Modern Horizons 3, having 2 complete cycles of MDFC lands that can enter the battlefield untapped. We've looked at it really close, literally every banned and restricted announcement since Modern Horizons 3 came out. It's something that a number of players like and have adapted over time. I know it's something where a couple of people kind of latched on to my comment about deep rules knowledge and deep knowledge of the card pool. The adaptation of a card like Jack-O-Lantern out of Midnight Hunt, I think, is fairly emblematic of how deep into the tank some of these players are willing to go to try and tune their deck over time. And in spite of all of that, its win rate is falling within a fairly healthy margin. On any given week, it's not deviating more than 3 or 4% from 50% of its a 50% match win rate. It also is only 4 to 6% of the field most of the time. So it is really hard for us to want to take action in a format that is generally pretty small and pretty hard to get into, against approximately 1/20th of the player base wanting to win about half of their matchups in a really strange way. I think there are eras of Legacy where people would have likely felt similar about variants of Dredge, for example, where it's doing something really strange and you have to build your deck in a really specific way in order to combat it, and not a ton of people are playing it. But I think over time, Dredge is something that is an iconic defining thing in Legacy that keep Legacy players coming back to the format. I know it's huge in Vintage as well. It's not super clear to me where it isn't necessarily the best deck in Modern. It also is not the best deck in Vintage, that it is outside of the power band of Legacy. It is just really hard to want to delete the experience for a portion of players whenever it is not putting up the meta share or win rate that generally would line up with a ban, even if it is a fairly strange to negative play pattern. There are also other decks in a similar spot. Mystic Forge combo is one that can take a pretty long time to win and have this non-deterministic combo thing that we generally balk at. But I will say, given that it is something that a lot of players feel pretty negatively about, I know we've talked about in this show even some decks being pretty negative to sit on the other side from and having a terrible emotional experience around them. It really would not take very much where if it's regularly cracking more than 10% of the metagame, if it's winning more than 55% of its matches on the regular, then, or if it's winning a bunch of the Eternal weekends that are coming up, really easy for us to end up going after it because it's not something that we want to be the best thing to do in Legacy. But for the most part, it feels like players are opting into the experience, and Legacy is a great place for them to get to do that.
All right. Let's move on to Historic. So we unbanned Counterspell in Historic. As you mentioned at the top, and we've seen a lot of questions about this, Soren has started putting up some really strong results in Historic. How and for those at home, there is somewhat of Historic is an arena format, and so it gets treated a little bit differently. They have reams of data on everything, and it lives only there. But how are you all thinking about Soren in Historic right now?
So this is one where I don't want to speak too much for the arena team, whatever. They're not here to give their own perspectives, but generally in an Eternal format, especially a non-rotating one like Historic, you can end up seeing anytime you apply much competitive pressure to something, something new and maybe overpowered, maybe not overpowered emerge, but its first week is unbelievable.
Yeah.
It is really hard to disentangle at this point if Soren is going to be something that is inappropriately strong for the format, or if a tier 1 deck had a breakout weekend and this is something that the format is going to absorb over time. Ideally, a card like Counterspell is something that is strong against Soren on the draw, and there are a bunch of cards like Fane Ripper where the game might end before you ever get a chance to cast the card.
Yeah.
Obviously, that combo ended up proving too strong for Pioneer, but Historic is something that I believe is stronger than Pioneer. The era has mattered a lot on if that is true or not, but it isn't clear that it can't hang in that format as a regular player. I know vampires in general are something that players think is a pretty cool type of strategy to lean into. So especially in line with what we said earlier about wanting to give players more places to play with their cards on Arena, I think the Arena team's going to need to take a bit more time to look at the data and see how it performs week over week.
Okay. Let's go back to Legacy. So two things. One I'll handle real quickly. So there are some people pointing out that the EU Eternal Weekend is right after November 24th. We'll go take a look at that timing. And if there needs to be an adjustment specifically for that weekend, we can talk about if we make that. So stay tuned on that timing.
I would not say it's completely off the table.
Yeah,
for things
it's
to
not
happen
off the
there.
table.
Like that's something where
It's a
especially
big
when we don't
weekend.
get a ton of like weekends for this, and those are the coolest weekends in
Yeah.
Eternal Magic. It's just that's something where I geeked about Eternal Weekend before I worked at Wizards. I watch coverage with my friends online at home. Not just, of course, I would never go in too hard on this, but I think those are great, and I really want to make sure that we're setting as many of those players up to have a great time. And if it looks like action needs to be taken, I don't want to say that, oh, it's the week before, therefore our hands are tied. That is not the case here.
No. So we'll discuss some timing stuff and get back to you all. The next question, some people did, so you discussed Oops All Spells. There are some questions about UB Reanimator. So we've taken a few shots at UB Reanimator for a few BNR announcements. How do you feel those have played out? How do you see UB Reanimator in the format right now?
So at this point, I think the deck is pretty firmly the strongest one at the moment. It's definitely the most represented one. It is really hard for us to tell if it is because these are cards that people like playing with and have played with for a long time, where kind of the promise of Eternal formats in general is that your cards are not going to go away if you fall in love with a deck. Here's your stop. You're going to love playing this deck. So after 2 years of this deck being the best deck, it's really not super clear if this deck is inappropriately strong or if part of its meta share is because players really like playing with these cards. There have been some very competitive events in the last month or two that Reanimator was not the largest, or was not close to the most successful deck in them. I know I in the article pointed to a recent Legacy showcase that had one Reanimator deck in the top 8. You could make You could make a case for there being two. There was a cool Roiling Dragonstorm deck that ended up top 4ing that I think played the card Reanimate.
Okay.
But for the most part, it feels like the format is fairly diverse for the most part, and there are ways to fight the deck at this point. Every adjustment we've made has been an attempt to depower the archetype over time rather than outright kill it.
Yeah.
So I think the process is mostly working as intended. We've seen its win rate come down. I believe its play rate has come down 10-ish to 15-ish% since we last talked on your show, which is exactly what we wanted to happen.
Yeah.
If we wanted to take a Sledgehammer to a combo deck, we know how to do that.
Yeah.
But the reason we went after Troll of Khazad-dûm was to force it to be a little bit more committal, hurt its consistency. It feels like it has done those things. If we're back here in 6 months and it looks like it's still putting up the best win rate, if it has gone up in meta share, this is a different discussion. But whenever the line is continuing to go downward, I am generally pretty happy to let the format kind of explore itself.
Okay. All right, makes sense. Next up, back to Standard, there have been a few questions on Stockup, seeing a good amount of play. Was Stockup ever under discussion for this, or how are you thinking about Stockup?
We touched it a little bit in discussion. I think, if I remember correctly, the stat is that it was in like 60% of decks at the Pro Tour. At the same time, Is It Prowess was 40% of the field, so it's kind of hard to take too much from that stat when the field was so skewed.
4 Core Steel Cutters always bring 4 Stockups with them. It's really hard to know if that's a Stockup thing or a Steel Cutter thing.
Right. But yes, Stockup is quite strong. It's very likely to be played in every blue deck. We like Blue's, one of Blue's core strengths being card draw. We're happy that a divination variant is seeing play in Standard. Time will tell if it's too strong. I wouldn't be shocked if, like, next year we're early rotating Stockup, but we're going to give it some more time. It is clearly strong, but it is not clearly too strong at this point.
I honestly feel like it's been a while since the best card draw spell's been blue.
That's a lot. I mean, there's a pretty intentional big swing. We argued about 4 versus 5 for some of the most heated red-in-the-face arguments you've ever seen play design get into, or just, no, you're crazy.
Who knew? Over Stockup. All right, let's continue going through some questions. Let's see. Okay, I'm seeing enough questions about Intomb specifically in Legacy that I would love for you to talk about Intomb.
Yeah, sure. Generally speaking, I think Intomb has been one of the most fun parts of the Reanimator deck for a lot of players. This is not always as true, but there are times where people will frequently have extra bullets for their quote-unquote reanimate package out of the sideboard. I think playing with a bunch of one-off big dome creatures is kind of one of the fun dreams that Reanimator is selling you. If the deck ends up proving to be too strong, that's a card that could be looked at. I am a bit more reticent to go after it because I think it is more fun if the games play out where sometimes this is an extremely dated example. I don't think this card still sees much play. Please don't eat me alive in the comments. I think it's fun if you get Inkwell Leviathan sometimes. Instead of where if Intomb is cut from the mix, it's more likely that your decks are what you'll see out of Sneak and Show, which is largely a pile of its best 2 threats over and over. Sometimes that's Emrakul Gristlebrand, sometimes it's Atraxa instead. But you just see fewer different things being the end goal for a Reanimator deck whenever you don't have that tutoring element. So I think the deck is generally funner whenever that, or more fun whenever that card is part of the mix, which has me more interested in preserving it. It's entirely possible it's the thing that pushes it over the top, but at this point I think these shapes of Reanimator decks are funner enough that it is more likely I would attack the card Reanimate if I were to try and take some more points off of the strategy.
Okay. All right. I've seen a number of questions about upcoming formats for RCQs, for other events. We don't have any news on any of those today, and I don't, off the top of my head, remember when any of those announcements are. But the play team is definitely on top of making sure that those get announced in a timely manner. Let's see. I think this is a fairly easy question, but it's a good one. If there are 6 sets for standard in a year and the lifespan is 3 years, will the quote-unquote usual standard consist of 18 sets in the future?
6 sets a year, 3 years in standard. That would be the max size would be 18 sets, and it would go from 13 to 18. So I would say
It's 19.
Oh, right. Foundations as well.
Foundations,
So
yes.
that puts the average at like 15 sets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Foundations, it's just there. It's always there. Love it. Let's see. Any further consideration of making a legacy format panel? So this is a question that has come up a few times. We have one for Pauper specifically. We have one for Commander. Have there been any further discussions in the legacy or vintage? I know has come up in the past as well for a format panel.
In general, we prefer to keep those sorts of things in-house. That's really the whole statement on it.
Okay. When do you think you'll get rid of scheduled ban announcements?
At Magic.
Probably, yeah. Probably never. So we do, but I will take that question seriously because we do get the question often, like, why don't you just ban things when you feel it's time? Mm-hmm. There are a couple reasons. Because we did live in this world, mm-hmm. and not everybody's been playing Magic this long. I don't expect everyone to remember this, but a few years ago, we did live in this world where it was just like, we're just going to take action when we want to take action. Now, it led to a couple things. One, it led to a lot of uncertainty mm-hmm. with people. We would every week get people tagging us and saying, hey, is there going to be any action? I'm prepping for a tournament, and I'd like to know if I need to, like, I want to play the best deck, but is it going to get banned? And
I had an article back in the day, I think it was called A Week in the Life of a Grinder during the Felidar Week ban, where it was just chronicling the whole thing, like journal style with timestamps and everything, and it was just panic-stricken. Oh my God, a ban happened midweek when I thought a ban wasn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. I now also have to try and source a whole new deck out of nowhere because I'm leaving for the tournament venue in 16 hours. What do I do?
Yeah. We want people to be able to plan. Right. People often for events, for Magic Cons, for RCQs, for regional championships. There's a lot of planning that goes into that. Sometimes people will plan vacations around them, or they'll be flying somewhere, or driving somewhere for the weekend. And the fact that we have the power to upend things like that, where a lot of planning, just not what deck you're playing, but a lot of planning goes into that, we take really seriously. Yeah. And we don't want to mess with people that way, because that's a bad experience before you even get to the tournament hall. Yeah.
Fundamentally, banned and restricted is an exercise in trading off stability in the game for gameplay. Yeah. And we've been really far on gameplay at points when we didn't have scheduled announcements, and we're very clear that sacrificed too much stability. Yeah. So we keep tweaking with it a little bit, like the cadences have changed somewhat, trying to find that best inflection point of maximizing how much stability and how much players can feel like they can safely get into a format and spend their time learning a deck with keeping the gameplay as good as it can be. And it is a trade-off, and we can't do both 100% all the time. So we're trying to figure out how to do both as much as possible. Mm-hmm.
And it presents a communications challenge as well. Like we, at the last ban announcement, we said we are not doing any modern changes during this window. But when we came here, people missed that, or they didn't we don't expect everyone reads everything that we do all the time. And so we got questions like, why didn't you talk more about modern? What happened with modern? And we know we had said we weren't going to do anything, but that message doesn't always get out there. And so, when we get questions like, well, why don't you just do format-specific ones off here and there? And it's like, that's one of the reasons, because it's a big challenge to communicate to the millions of players worldwide exactly what these moments are. And so we have to balance both, as you said, gameplay and consistency and messaging too. We're not saying we get it right every time. Certainly, we've gone through windows in the past where we're like, oh, we let this one linger too long, or we pulled the trigger too soon. And so we're always tweaking it and can always do better.
Magic's just in general more fun the less homework you have to do and the more you get to do, just play the game. Like I know there's a point where having a bunch of every different format gets its own bespoke timings sounds cool until you run an LGS and have to keep up with all of these different BNRs for every FNM. And then that is its own hurdle. It just like you're saying, it just adds a layer of difficulty to engage with the game.
Yep. All right, we have a couple minutes left, and there are a couple good specific questions here. Can we get some thoughts on Pioneer Izzet Phoenix and its adaptation of Corey's Steelcutter, making an already top-tier deck with Treasure Cruise even stronger?
Yeah, so that is a deck that is really strong. We're going to be keeping an eye on it as it develops. This is one where we know Corey's Steelcutter, clearly too strong for Standard. This is something that you talked about a little bit before. Treasure Cruise is another one that has been too strong for Eternal formats. So this is a deck that is almost in this weird inflection point of, okay, well, what cards are strong enough where? And some of that comes down to the card pool and the answers that are available. It is not clear what is or is not appropriate for the deck yet. We want to see how it plays out over time. But generally speaking, players have a lot of fun doing more powerful things.
Yeah.
So whenever we can preserve those things and the format can absorb it, we would like for that to be the case. That happens, right?
Yeah.
To go back to the players like playing powerful stuff point, there's a reason Vintage Cube is the most popular one, right? It's fun to have your pop-off turn with Black Lotus or Ancestral Recall or Treasure Cruise or something like that. We really don't want to ban a card like Treasure Cruise until we are positive that it cannot hang in Pioneer anymore, because that is basically the last place in Magic you can really play with it at this point. So to that end, some of this is kind of in line with what I was describing earlier in Legacy, where it's about breadth of experience in Magic and making sure that if there is something you want to do with Magic cards, I can point you to a format and say, hey, you want to do hacky graveyard stuff, that's your guy.
Yeah.
You want to play Treasure Cruise, that's your guy. You want to play Standard, like you want to just play things that are a bit more mid-rangey, maybe a slower pace, that's your guy. So.
Back to Standard. Well, I agree with all of the ban decisions. Could you please elaborate on why you felt comfortable not hitting any pieces from Demir, i.e. Kaito or Curiosity?
Sure. The Demir deck is a cool kind of mid-range deck. It gets squeezed between a lot of the different types of decks that can exist. We hadn't really seen any evidence that it was going to be particularly overbearing, and we think that it's most likely to have a healthy place in the format going forward. I know right now it is one of the key decks that kind of survived unscathed in 7 cards getting banned, so I believe it is very likely to be the most popular deck for the next couple of weeks at the very least, but I expect we'll see some more shakeups coming with rotation and as people explore the new metagame.
All right. Okay. We are out of time, but thank you two for coming on and talking about all things B and R. Our next one is scheduled for November, so we'll be back to talk about it then. In the meantime, we are heading into Edge of Eternity season. So we have right now on the web a story for Edge of Eternities that is getting rave reviews. It is ongoing. Definitely head to dailymtg.com to check that out. We're on chapter, God, I want to say 7. I could be wrong about that. Don't roast me. But we're heading.
I almost held up a number of fingers that was not 7, so now I'm nervous.
I don't know. It could be 8. I don't know. Anyway, that story is ongoing and is heading towards a conclusion, but not there yet. And then we will have the debut for Edge of Eternities next week on Tuesday, and then we will be right here on Weekly MTG to do the after show immediately after that, to talk about what we just saw, to preview some more cards, and to generally talk about this awesome upcoming set. So the next few Weekly MTGs are all going to be focused on Edge of Eternities. So until then, we will see you next week.